So we'll get started. Thanks for the music. Thanks everyone for coming. This is as usual. Some opening remarks. So basically the program is I'm just going to introduce Tianna and Adachi Tomomi, and then Tianna will be giving us a presentation, and Tomomi will give us a performance of some of his electronic voice pieces and sound poems. And Tianna will be typing in response to Tomomi's performance, so you have eye candy on both sides. We're lucky to be joined by Tomomi Adachi. He's coming from Tokyo. He happens to have a residency in New York this semester, thanks to the Asian Cultural Council. So we're lucky to have him here in Philadelphia. And Tianna Kennedy for coming. She's rolled into Philly after 1,400 miles of cross-country travel. Tianna's kind of a wanderer, of which I'll say more later. But first, I want to say how exciting it is for me for the second edition in the series. Working in different ways with the arts of transmission in the broadest sense, these two sound artists, organizers, and performers consistently engage with issues of improvisation and the manifold processes of mediation that both constitute the signal and introduce the noise and all these aesthetic signals that we travel. So first I'll introduce Adachi Tomomi. Born in Kanazawa, Japan in '72, he's a performer, composer, and sound poet, installation artist, and occasional theater director. He studied philosophy and aesthetics at Waseda University in Tokyo, and his improvised poetics include voice, livetronics, and self-made instruments, some of which you'll see tonight. His Tomomin is a well-known handmade electric instrument, which many musicians have used. Basically what I wanted to highlight was Tomomi's forms of electronic vocal performance that, once coupled with live processing techniques, have inspired this series from the start. Acting archivally both to unearth Japanese sound poetry traditions and to reinterpret, update, and continue projects of the historic avant-garde, their sonata, for example. He pairs this archival function with tremendous futuricity. When people ask about Tomomi's work, videos of which you can find on PenSound or audio on UbuWeb, I tend to describe it as a kind of mangled insectoid alien futurism. In the tradition of Henry Chopin's vocal manipulations, expanded voice articulated by Joan LaBarbera, in a league with the development of improvised music and noise in Japan, Tomomi's experience make much of the analog sound poetry of his contemporaries sound positively archaic. With these traditions in play and an intensive focus on the mediating technologies, Tomomi, after all, invented a series of handmade instruments. And the last time I saw him, as he reminded me today, in Shibuya, Tokyo, he was delicately plucking and picking and wrapping the scrambled set of looked like trash or sort of metal detritus that were amped up by contact mics and generating this incredibly overwhelming sound. But as I was saying, with these traditions in play and an intensive focus on mediating technologies, both phonetic, electronic, and algorithmic, Tomomi is surely transmitting more than his voice today. He's programming space for these networks to play themselves out. Meanwhile, Tianna's sustained engagement with radio and transmission arts, improvised music performance, her cello, which she doesn't have, unfortunately, today, scratchings have been heard in more venues than I can probably count, and the organization of community-oriented, sustainable, often mobile, and really magical spaces. I met Tianna on the Empty Vessel, this project where they had outfitted an old World War II boat as an experimental venue, an event space, which was squatting, or you could say glittering, along the Gowanus Canal in a number of places. So this all weaves together a dense system of investigations into what Elena Esposito has termed the arts of contingency, of which Tianna and I have been talking. The ephemeral nature of her various projects keeps a hyperactive archivist like myself at bay. Her pirate radio tutorials and transmissions, which have been recorded, durational engagements along various waterways, gallery art spaces, curatorial efforts come and gone, and guest appearances improvised on the spot. Like Sendrar's radio blanket, Tianna seems to operate everywhere and off the grid all at once. She's a fixture constantly on the move, deftly negotiating the turbulent flows of independent art and the possibilities of political expression. And by this I mean thinking specifically of the way in which which work responds to Alexander Galloway's remarks on a potential counter-protological practice in a time of ubiquitous control, namely that a new exploit is necessary, one that is asymmetrical in relationship to distributed networks, as the distributed network was to the power centers of modernity. So, with that, I present Tianna.
That's quite an intro. I feel like I don't need to give the talk now. At any rate, when Danny asked me to do this, I thought that he wanted me to do an academic lecture on like the poetics of live editing and sound, sort of the genealogy of sound poetry, and I really didn't know what I was going to say because I didn't have anything to say about that. But then I showed up and he's like, no, just talk about your stuff. But don't make it an artist talk, but talk about your stuff. So I'm going to try to talk about my stuff, and maybe instead of belaboring all of the various things I've done, just kind of highlight a couple and talk about mostly why I do what I do and why I hope that we can all work together to create spaces for new possibility right there. So this is kind of a little bit of a mess in an improvisatory talk, because that's the only way I know how to do it. But I have some pictures and some sound and some words, so hopefully it'll be okay. And if you get lost, the whole thing is just summed up right here. This is sort of the gist of it, so that you can just walk away now if you want. But it was, I think this is kind of like poetic and beautiful, and I really liked it. I just was going to a talk, and Alain Badiou described the art imperative as a continuation despite impossibility, and the process of the artist as that of inscribing the inexistent immaterial form. So that can manifest in whatever way it manifests, but the resulting work, whether or not it's a success from the artist's point of view, nevertheless is generative. It's because the engagement, those who listen and see and participate, interpret it as they will, and that calls into being a multiplicity of new possibilities. And I think that in sort of our world right now, that's the most important thing, because another sort of talk I saw was Zizek, and he was talking about how it's easier for us all to imagine like a cataclysmic end to all life as we know it than like a slight political shift. It's like easier to like think about us all dying than like living a little bit differently and not going to the grocery store and spending money on groceries. So at any rate, opening these spaces for different sorts of possibilities and priorities has always been sort of what I'm interested in. And so I kind of have been doing all these crazy things to get at something that is meaningful. And most of the time it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And so here's sort of the journey. And in these spaces that I like to create, or that I like to work with people to create, I'm interested in places that don't have sort of a prescribed behavioral norm. Like here we are, right? I'm talking, you guys are sitting there politely, no matter who's talking here, you knew that this was going to go down tonight when you got here, And so I'm interested in creating spaces that you kind of walk into and you're like, what do? I don't know. And then you have to talk to the other person next to you and ask them what to do, and then you get to know people. And so I've enjoyed radio because I was a musician forever, but I got really bored at shows because there are musicians playing shows and people standing there and then you leave. But in radio, whether or not anyone's listening out in the world, in the ether, the musicians engage and the people participating engage totally differently than they would at a rock venue, because they're all kind of like listening differently and working together. And so that's sort of why I got into radio, and then all the boat stuff that you'll see later is a similar sort of project. But so these are the three things that Danny touched on, so I thought I would just go with that because it's the easiest. So let's go down. Blah, blah, blah. Grew up in the suburbs. Dad's a cop. Mom's a teacher. They like Chrysler LeBarons and diamonds and fur coats. And I didn't care about that. And so I played the cello in rock bands, which is a good way to make sure that you're going to be in poverty for the rest of your life and not have any of those good things. And so I moved to New York, and I went to college. I was interested in writing, so it's kind of fun that I'm here in this writer's house. Also, my mom was a geography professor, and so I used to go camping in the Pinnacottes, and that was really fun. So I was like, what is this geography stuff? So I started reading some of it, and one geographer that I really liked was also kind of a situationist. You guys might know those early art guys. But he was interested in looking at space, and so Marxism not just as an idea, but as a material reality, and sort of how this social social lives create this space that reproduces these problematic modes of production, right? So I started being interested in how like people's actions affected reality, I guess, in this way. I don't know if I have to read any of this because you guys can read as well as I. But basically, he's saying that space is a tool of thought and action, and a means of control. So that was something that was kind of like clunking around in the back of my mind when I moved to New York and saw this great manifestation of just that, of Manhattan and the Twin Towers and all of that stuff. And then I was working in a gallery trying to make some money, and then September 11th happened, and I decided to quit working in the gallery because that was a drag, and I didn't feel like selling art was relevant or interesting. And then I went on tour, and then I wrecked the van, and then I went to Guatemala and got malaria, and then I was like, oh God, what do? I guess I go to grad school. So then I went to grad school. And then I started reading books. I got in this I was in this class with Alan Weiss, who's a really wonderful guy and writer and philosopher. And I was reading Wireless Imagination and Radio Text and Experimental Sound and Radio. And then later I met this great guy named Joe Maludis, who's really wacky and fun. And he wrote The Ether, the Nothing That Connects Everything. And I got really into radio. And I was like, that's kind of an intersection of writing and music and experimentation and possibility and, communication with aliens and global peace and all this stuff. So I was like, yeah, let's get into this. So I started a pirate radio station with some friends out in Bushwick, and we started doing kind of the weird little performances, radio plays, nonsense. Maybe like people in a 3-block radius heard us, like nobody was really listening, but every Tuesday we were out there, making some noise. And then I got and it had been a pirate radio station in Tampa that moved to Brooklyn, and then they had been, unlike most pirate radio stations that have like a little clubhouse and everybody comes in and does their clubhouse stuff, this one was kind of a roving pirate radio station, and they would show up to people's events and broadcast it and just flyer the neighborhood like it was a rock show, and so people would be like, oh, I'll tune in. And early on they were interested in video art and all this other stuff, and so when I got involved, I was just a cellist, and they were just, I would do these pirate radio things, and then they would organize events and be like, oh no, we're missing a sound artist. Tianna, will you play? So that's sort of how I was like, okay. I was meeting all these jazz improv guys and doing some improv with them, and so suddenly I went from just being a rock cellist to being a sound artist. And then I was like, this is pretty fun, this art stuff. So then I started making sculptures and all this other stuff, and then I started curating shows, and then 10 years went by. No, I guess like 6 years. And I was running this venue in Brooklyn that was a little clubhouse pirate radio station, but we only recorded live shows, like live rock bands. It wasn't like, a DJ would come in and play their favorite Eagles albums or whatever. It was all these kids that wanted some place to play, and nobody else would let them play in New York because their music was crazy. So all these bands that you now know about used to play in our space. But then we became a nonprofit because that was a way to get money. And so then we started up a label. We were like, yeah, we'll do a record label, we'll have a gallery, we'll have some artists, we'll do a residency program, let's move upstate and have a sculpture garden, let's do radio labs so we can teach other people how to do pirate radio. let's do this stuff. And then it got a little out of control. And then we stormed the art world because nobody was doing transmission art. We weren't sound art, we weren't visual art, and the galleries are all like, ooh, something different. And so we got to go to Korea, and we got to go to Finland and Poland and Warsaw and do all these crazy things. And it's fun. So if you guys want an art career, create your own genre. That's that lesson. And here's the website. It's super confusing. I quit after a while because it's a little crazy. But the good news with these guys is they kind of lost sight, in my opinion, of what they were doing originally because they were doing all this other stuff. But then, thanks to friends, there were these openings for low-power FM station applications for licenses, and Free 103, with a lot of help from Prometheus and other people, applied for a license, and they got one. So now there's a possibility that there will be a community radio station upstate, which will kind of bring it all back home. And that's a really wonderful, positive thing. And so if you guys are interested in talking to me about how to help out or whatever, I would be happy to talk to you about that. Anyway, so we have this transmission arts idea that is kind of, nobody really knows how to define it. And they're writing a book about it, kind of retroactively baptizing all these artists as transmission artists, just like the Mormons do with their relatives. And so that's kind of cool. But I'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, I just thought I would play. This is sort of what we were doing. Do you want to turn up the? Oh, I guess it's up. This is sort of this is sound art. So I do these performances and be a famous artist. That sounded like this, and they're really fun. It's fun to do this stuff. It's fun to make instruments and work with people and play music and go to Spain and all of that. So anyway, there's that one. Blah blah blah. Sounds like that. And then there's this one. It's kind of the same thing. This was called The Limit for the Lost Soul of the Gluttonous Shopper. But it was basically just, more nonsense, because that's what we like to listen to.
We can listen to it.
Well, we are running out of time, right? We have all this other stuff to talk about. Okay. And these are the list of the people that we worked with, which is a crazy list. And this isn't even the whole list. But these are the people that I've worked with and played with and performed with and blah, blah, blah. All right, so that's Free 103. And then let's see what else I have to say about it here. Blah blah blah. So yeah, you can codify it and talk about transmission art as radio broadcast, sound installation, performance, web-based projects, public works, and composition, which is how the book is broken down. And that's useful in an art historical sense, just to kind of figure out who's doing what. But for me, I was always interested because, as Joe Maluda says, the ether is the nothing that connects everything. It's this weird nebulous thing that doesn't really exist, and so you can make whatever you want out of it. And for me, radio was always more about, and Ellen Weiss and Gregory Whitehead talk about this too, the slippages, the noise, the interception, it's always been an experimental medium. Ever since it was created, it was, all the distance radio people and all the people broadcasting from hot air balloons being can we do this? We can do this, yay! It's always been totally crazy, and that's what appeals to me. It's kind of inherent in the medium. So, and also listening is part of it. And I was reading this great book called The Tanners that I recommend, and there's this little part about children being afraid of the dark, and when they're in the dark, they're not just listening, they're hearkening. Because when we speak of listening, this presupposes something to be heard, but hearkening is often done in vain. It's a waiting to hear, a hoping. So that's a big part of radio is I don't know, is it coming in? Or just waiting for the good song to come on, even in just regular radio. It's kind of like this Pavlovian thing where you have all the rats, and one button always gives you food, and the other button never gives you food, and the third button sometimes gives you food. And so the first two rats never touch their buttons because they know what to expect, but the third rat is just at the button all the time, and that's why people love radio so much. Anyway, so, whoa, hey, look, it's that time. Okay. And then, you know, broken transmitters, and so you go get pizza, and then you meet people, and that's fun. Okay, so it's like, the other thing I like is, like, that it reminds me of is, once a year, the circus comes to town, and there's some archaic rule about not moving elephants over bridges. So they move it through the 59th Street Tunnel from Queens to Manhattan every year. And if you know about it, you can go there in the middle of the night, and there will be elephants coming out of this tunnel, and like women in suits and horses and Shetland ponies, and someone sweeping up after them. And the most exciting part is right beforehand, when you're like running around looking for the elephants, and right afterwards when you're like, oh my god, there were elephants right there, you know? And that's sort of also what radio is to me. It's just like this kind of weird, magical thing that is improbable and shouldn't exist where it is and does. And some influences for me were Tetsuo Kagawa, who talks about radio as a centripetal force instead of a broadcast force. So like centrifugal means like you're isolating people and you're blah 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 and it's spinning, but centripetal means you're like bringing things to you. So when we did radio broadcasts, he would do micro radio broadcasts in huge big apartment complexes in Tokyo, and they would be little broadcasts, but everybody in the apartment complex could hear them, and they were talking about issues within that complex. So pretty soon all the neighbors were going upstairs and knocking on the door, and people were like getting in there and talking, and that's sort of the radio that I like. That's what I was doing too in these Bushwick performances, where people would just come to the actual broadcast, and whether or not anyone else was listening, and I like that. Brecht's two-way radio is one-sided when it should be two. It should be about communication. So any radio that gives public character to public occasions is a step with lots of P's in the right direction. And so that always meant a lot to me, and that's why I was stuck with Free 103 for 6 years, because I felt like it was doing that. And it's a fun game. So I did all these other little radio projects that were about, connecting people. But I'm not going to get into them because it will take too long. Okay, so then, Tom's like, I already talked about that. Okay, so then I got, through the Free 103, I got involved in a lot of political stuff. We set up a radio station during the Republican National Convention in 2004, and we all got arrested, and I kept doing all these community political actions, and we were always failing. Bloomberg would come and build the sky rises anyway, and things would happen, and it was like a drag, right? But the space of politics was great, and meeting the people and doing this stuff was really good. So we wanted a clubhouse where we'd still have that sort of feeling, but we wouldn't necessarily have to lose all the time. And so we dragged a boat down from the Bronx that we heard about and put it in the Gowanus, and then had all sorts of problems for a couple of years. And we knew when we got it that it was going to be a money suck and a time suck, and it would be a bad idea. We called the boat the worst idea ever before we called it the Empty Vessel Project. But anyway, it was great. So I have a couple, just a photo of it so you can see. are all my collaborators talking.
Okay. And I relearned the other day the definition of utopia coming from the Greek meaning no place, and was really happy to relearn that. So I'm feeling like I don't feel like it's failed utopia.
I'm gonna skip it. I'm gonna keep going because we're going. And on that boat, there were plans for other boat projects, and the other boat projects were more ambitious, like creating these floating utopias that would go down the Mississippi. And I stayed away from it because I was already running this project in Free 103 and was like, I'm not going to this meeting. You guys have the meeting on my boat. I'll see you later. But then 3 years later, I ended up getting involved anyway. And then last year, I ended up being the project manager of this crazy, ambitious, impossible thing. And I was like, well, that's the art imperative. Let's do it. So we decided to build boats in Slovenia, take them across the Adriatic Sea, take them through the canals of northern Adriatic to Venice, storm the Venice Biennale, do performances, and then pack them up without any funding from galleries. And so we raised all the money, organized everything, or I organized everything, and then we all went over and built the things and did the thing, and it worked, which was amazing. This is the one that succeeded. The other two projects weren't so successful, but here, maybe I'll wait. Do you want me to play a song while I do this? Hold on. No, I won't play a song. Okay, so this is what they look like in Slovenia when we were building them, getting ready to go. This is us showing up in some, this is basically like Modesto. Imagine these guys in Modesto, California, or like San Joaquin Valley. It's like farmland in Venice, and nobody uses these canals anymore. And people are just like, what? What's going on? We just hanging out, sleeping. And then that's what it looked like in the lagoons. It was just like these crazy open expanses with just fishing boats around. And we went across the Adriatic. Was crazy. There's lots of stories. I'll tell you all about it. That's the motor. The motors are made from Mercedes. And that's the whole front end of the car. You can just move it around, and that's the way you drive it, and it's biodiesel. Those are the 3 boats that we would put them all together and have swimming parties. Then we made it to Venice, and there's our boats next to the yachts that were there for the Biennale. And the fun part was we collected, we made this from scrap material in Slovenia, made all sorts of friends in Slovenia, made friends all the way along the way, collected art from them, to install in this cabinet of curiosities in the boat to take to the Biennale and be like, look, it's not exclusive art. It's from Slovenia and like wherever, and you can make it out of trash, and it'll be beautiful. And I made it, yay! And we made it. And this was my Slovenian friend. And when I showed up, I didn't know any Slovenians, and he took pity on me, and was just like, this is impossible, but if you really want me to drive you around, I'll drive you around. And then, like little by little, he got more involved and really was helpful. Then Venice loved us. It was great. We did these performances. People loved us. It was like a fairy tale. And then we snuck down the Grand Canal, which is totally illegal. And that was fun, too. Okay, so those are some art projects. And then one last thing, like 3 more minutes. This is an amazing email that maybe I'll leave up later about all the break-ins on the Empty Vessel project. It's just, they're so cute. Like all these people breaking in and painting the walls and breaking in and having a love affair and breaking in and whatever. So we were trying to decide whether to let people break in or not. Okay, so the real reason I do all this, and there's a little bit of the Lefebvre from when I was a kid, but then I keep reading, I'm trying to figure out why I do all this stuff. And why I'm interested in sound and improv and transmission. And I think this is sort of why. It's because when you're thinking about philosophy, you're sort of like creating ideas and then trying to fabricate reality out of that. And in Western philosophy and political thought, that's sort of, you're always distancing yourself from action so that you have a better idea of what's happening down below. And it's all about vision and control through vision. And so that's why I'm interested in sound and not vision, and interested in that messy spot in the middle when you try to intersect theory and action. And that's why I'm interested in like thinking about utopias instead of like political philosophy, because utopian writing or actions or whatever are not intended to become a reality. It's like just sort of just throwing out, an idea about, it's sort of giving you something to work against, I guess, or it's, anyway. That was totally inarticulate. I failed there. Okay, I'm going to keep going. The next part is action and what I'm more interested in, which is, so at any rate, I'm just going to read now. That which the Western tradition calls politics in reality is a model of depoliticization, that beginning with Aristotle and even more so with Plato expels plural and relational dimension of action. Politics, as envisioned by the tradition or order, presupposes and organizes fictitious entities, betrays which is most proper to politics, actions, relevation of the uniqueness and plurality of the subjects comprising the political body. And so basically it's saying that like what matters in politics are people, and that's always that's always overlooked. So politics should be about creating these spaces that I'm interested in for reciprocal self-revelation, where people can insert themselves into the human world with words and deeds and actions. So it's our duty to like make sure that these spaces exist where people are heard and can act in unpredictable, unique, spontaneous ways. And there are other people that think similarly. Judith Butler talks about how your identity is formed through iteration of action. So you are what you do, which is kind of basic. But so the distinction between the personal and the political, or between private and public itself, is a fiction designed to support an oppressive status quo. So our most personal acts are, in fact, continually being scripted by hegemonic social conventions and ideologies. So it's up to us to live the life that we want to live, I guess, and to share it with other people, whatever. And similarly, I was reading this book about tragedy, like Shakespearean drama, and even in this book, it was a similar theme. So you have, in comedy, the Greek tragedians took off their masks to expose the self. And he says that that's why Shakespeare is important, because in Shakespeare, Shakespeare represents the inheritability of cultural life, of human sociality, as propelled by shifting non-natural accounts of nature's claims on us. And yet, unlike the Greeks, Shakespeare's dramas also depict the transmission, worth, and desirability of any sociality as hemmed in by what we now know to be inherited failures of such accounts to one and for all. Satisfactory or desirably bind us to one another. You guys, I only have one contact in right now, and I can't really see, so this is hard to read. And this depiction is inseparable from, it's nothing other than uniquely dramatic breakdowns in the affairs of particular human beings, which means we can now see that the abstract stakes that form the drama's horizon are no more or no less significant, moving, ridiculous, or gripping than are the lives, loves, words, and deeds of unique human beings. So it's all about, being people and being kind to each other. And finally, a note on failure and utopia. Jameson's primary elaboration of this utopian function is the negative one. He begins with the empiricist maxim that nothing in the mind is not first in the senses, which indicates that our imaginations are constructs made up of the here and now. So sort of like a phenomenological approach. On the social level, this means that our imaginations are hostages to our own mode of production. It suggests that the best utopia can serve the negative purpose of making us more aware of our mental and ideological imprisonment, and that, therefore, the best utopias are the ones that fail most comprehensively. So, I guess to sum everything up, I'm interested in doing impossible things that are likely to fail in hopes that through that process, we'll get to know each other better and be kind to each other and learn about how to better exist in this world and create a better place to live through art and improv and sound and all of that. So that's it. That's the story.
Okay.
Oh, I forgot forgot to show you some other stuff. I'll show you other stuff later if you want.
We'll send the links around. It's too bad we can get to see all of the
Yeah.
works that are up there.
Yeah, I forgot. There's like this cool
There's
little
lots of
thing.
stuff around that we can sort of send. And
If you
we'll
like,
look at it later.
if you like
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
All right.
So we have Tomomi. Are you ready to perform now? Yeah. Okay. Is it hot? Is everyone okay? You can hear it from the time.
So, hello everybody. So, for coming and especially thank you for yes, so I will perform some short pieces. So, generally performance, I don't speak so much now. And yes, so as introduction, I will perform short improvisation, voice, and electronics. Yes, so little bit I talk about what I'm doing. So basically I regard me as a musician, not poet, and I'm working on voice, gesture, electronics, and self-made instruments, and sometimes video and sometimes installations. So also I regard me as the word is correct. So sound poet in a relationship to voice and gesture. So today I will present performances with words, voice, and sometimes with gestures, and also electronics already I did. So yes, I must explain a little bit about each pieces. So the next piece is my new piece. So it's premiere actually. So I'm feeling sorry. So anyway, so title is Face. So for voice and gesture. So the concept is very, very clear. So if you see it, so I don't need to explain about it. Anything about it? Cheek, 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 head, cheek, head, cheek, head, cheek, cheek, head, cheek, head, cheek, head, cheek. Warhead, 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 cheek, 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 head, 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 warhead, nose, 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 mouth, nose, 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 throat, throat, head, ear, forehead, cheek, head, ear. Cheek, head, ear, forehead, cheek, head, ear. Cheek, head, ear, forehead, cheek, head, ear. Throat, throat, voice, 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 loud, 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 silence. Maybe I need a little bit more practice. Yes, the next piece is it's my sound poem. So title is Another Five. So you can find the recording on YouTube. So it is written in Japanese, but don't worry. So if you don't understand Japanese, because the meanings are not important. So it has a stupid melodramatic story, but also it has a strict phonetic structure. あなた5。あなた、あの言葉は嘘だったのね。私帰るわ。あなた、あの言葉かわ嘘だったものね。私帰るだわ。あなた、あの言葉かわ嘘だったものね。私帰るのだわ。あなた、あの言葉かわ嘘だったものね。私帰るのだわ。あなた、あの言葉かわ嘘だったんだものね。私帰るにいるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉かわ嘘だったんだものね。私帰るになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉かわ嘘言わなだったんだものね。私お帰りになるになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉か言わそう言わなだったんだものね。私お帰りになるになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉か言わすこと言わなだったんだものね。私お帰りになるになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりを言わすこと言わなだったさんだものね。私お帰りになるになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりの言わそのこと言わなだったさんだものね。私お帰りになる間になるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりのかって言わそのこと言わなだったさんだものね。私お帰りになるままになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりだったのよかって言わそのこと言わなだったさんだものね。私お帰りになるまつまになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりだったのよかって言わそのこと言わなだったさんだものね。私お帰りになるつまつまになるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりだったのよかって言わそのこと言わなだって私さんだものね。私お帰りになる妻の妻になるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりだったのよかって言わそのこと言わなだって私の小田さんだものね。私お帰りになる妻の妻になるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりだったのよかって言わそのことは言わないだって私の小田さんだものね。私お帰りになる妻に他の妻になるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかりだったのよかって言ったらもうそのことは言わないだって私の小田さんだものね。私お帰りになる妻に他の妻になるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかさんだったのよ分かっていたらもうそのことは言わないだって私の小田さんだものね。私お帰りになる妻にあなたの妻になるのだわ。あなた、あの言葉ばかさんだったのよ分かっていたもうそのことは言わないだって私の小田さんだものね。私岡田絵里になるつまりあなたの妻になるのだわ。Yes, so I need to talk about the next piece a little bit. So it's my sound poem. So to compose the next piece, I used Manyoshu. So the oldest Japanese anthology in 8th and 9th centuries. It was written in Chinese characters, not Japanese characters. Japanese character didn't exist that time yet. So, but it written by Chinese character, but not Chinese. So they are used as phonograms, so not as ideograms. So yeah, it's very simple explanation. So, but the system of pronunciation is not same with the present way, a little bit complicated story. So I intentionally misread the original poem and transform it. So it loses meanings, but still it keeps some sound aspect of the original poem. セカンド種せっかの周平なき者は私次離れるその人に続きいる者の鼻草に踏まれいきなりトライひじびるからたまたまやたもとに任しチョコ小だらでらびをさはりであそこ家だけどの盛りやと昔足具のそのレレレレレレみたのはたらか空も見かけに水見のばかそかの振りかぶくれないよいもてもだるべによよよよ口の気はわかに来たりひましゃらはとととこさびどらしゃらきちちちきしきにきしにち花まだすみよこだに一気に持ちて赤ごまにしずくらにちいけよっぱピのピツツピアスビ歩き潮の中水一に歩きる男らなに探しだとやんすびらきたりやよってたまままてやたらやでさすが浮かびやその世のいくびをら られたとかに歴史にたかえて通いばことにいたられこらにとつばばゆききパカクのおならしてさまきはって命をしけとすぶすべはなし。Yes, the next I interpret some of historical Japanese sound and visual forms. So now I will present the first Japanese published sound poem in 1924. So written by futurist painter Hideki Noshita. So it was published on a magazine titled Marvel. So it's the earliest Japanese avant-garde magazine. So by Japanese Dadaist and the futurist group in 1920s. So actually this is written under the influence of Russian futurists, especially Zaun by Plevnikov. Voice sound poetry form began with sticks. Japanese poet, so his name is Nikuni Seiichi. So he was an active and very important Japanese concrete poet. And he was active during 1960s and 70s in the international concrete poetry movement. So he died in 1977. So I will perform his early sound and visual poem now. So he reached this kind of poetry around 1960, so without any direct influences from other concrete poets. オーパスキよったらんけきれにたんとれであんとさけりたいそそれびだだだめんき君と立ちはるとといっとんあっとんくんとんるげしゃみどるとるばってきそけだけきんききとピアノののさされっぽだるだるりんいきにびんがパパとかにカポカででききったねたんたんつむむるへたなんヨートプスガンクルリンはははげもぎろちちとくえおさいそさいめはくそくゆくこどっちにとあっちにともさけるぐったんキュンキュンキュンけすかぱらきあはりはりきぐんびきんとれんぐるうみこみくみとめきんのつつんとらいそしよっぱくるたっとわいのぬけきんぐったらきそれみたんだだらきだそすみきぶとんがとぼっとみきそくてぎんききるどうとぷきガングルマンダルダルリンはちにみんがギーギーギーえむむるとったなならんさきみるぐったんもれみそみきみとるれのきはきうすのいゆさいだパッパパキューキルてちぬんぬんぬん傷がほらひなぐみきすれんとるともつもらすとかひっぱかくガングミングあちゃんいろれとあいのとききすまきちゃみとるとるぱきピンのピンだピンあんぱきっぱりきききれんくさきりっきとびんがもきれぽんだかびかきほきででっきらきみとくるぱりきぽんYes, also the next piece is the Nikuni's work. So it's actually a visual form. So maybe you cannot see it well, but something like this. So visual arrangement of Chinese characters. So it's not for read, of course, to see. So, but I realized that the visual elements. So by using electronics. Second hand. Actually, the title is just the name of the interface. So I built for this piece. So in this piece, I emphasize visual element of speech and music. So I speak something, just for example, now I'm moving hand like this. So my question is, what is this? So yes. So also, so you noticed, so when I perform something, so my hand is moving something like this. So I don't know what is this. Yes. So, but the next piece is kind of answer. Yes. So I want to use this kind of gesture as a musical parameter. And yes. So moment, and it's time to permission for it. Yes. And in this piece, the gesture is quite important aspect of music. And this is the interface I built for this piece. So it has many sensors. It's distance sensors. And it means that these shots can capture the movement of my body. And it has also some buttons, and it can make sample my voice. Like this. And now, so this computer is modulating my voice. So some way, and I can change how it will work. Like